So the first part was where we talked about financial markets and the different assets there. Then, until recently, we were talking about, well, I guess two things. One is the banking system, how it works, and the other was the various ways in which the Fed regulates the banking system, requirements on what limits on what banks can and cannot do, and also all these interest rates that the Fed manipulates. What's missing about all this, although it's been hinted at several times, is that what happens in financial markets doesn't just stay there, but it affects all the other markets, has the potential to affect all the other markets in the economy, and so that means that it has macroeconomic implications. And so the last part of the class is where we study those. Of course, in order to do that, we need some sort of model of how the macroeconomy functions. And that model is going to, well, we're going to need that model to be able to address certain things that we care about, that the Fed cares about, that are the main topics of macroeconomics. One is going to be that, as discussed, if things start to go badly wrong in financial markets, then they mess up the economic activity of everybody else in the economy. Macroeconomists tend to measure economic activity in terms of production. So the financial markets messing up economic activity means financial markets interfering with our ability to produce goods and services. But another thing that the Fed cares about and that financial markets can affect is inflation. So we'll need our model to be able to capture that as well. And a third thing that we all care about that's become a serious issue over the past year or so is unemployment, or maybe more generally non-employment, because unemployment means you look for work. If you drop out of the labor force altogether because you gave up, you don't count as unemployed. But anyway, let's just call it unemployment for now. So we'll need a macro model that can tell us about production, inflation, and, at least in the background, what's happening to employment. And to do that, first, we need to define what those things are. So, of course, you've all taken macroeconomics 10-12. Some of you may have taken intermediate macro. But since it's so important to make sure that we have clear definitions when we're talking about anything, I think our first order of business beyond this overview of the structure of the class is to define production and inflation, and then we'll get to the real business of trying to define a macroeconomic model for the class. Any questions, comments about the game plan here? So again, this should be a refresher for everyone, but some of you have done macro more recently, some have done it a while ago. And so I thought a quick refresher would be a good idea. So let's start with our first problem, which is to define the measure of economic activity defined in terms of production. Now, the most common measure of production that we're going to use is what's known as GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. The name itself tells us that we're trying to measure production with this. And, well, we just want to get a measure of everything that was produced. Well, presumably, if we're trying to get a sense of economic activity in a particular case, we need to be talking about a particular place, let's say the United States, and we'll need to talk about a particular time period, let's say 2020, for example. So let me start writing out a definition. As I do it, we'll see that there's some nuances we need to take care of, and then we will. So we are trying to get a measure of the total production of, I'm going to leave a blank space here, we'll come back to that. Like this T here, like my phone, like the house I'm in. But those aren't the only things that are produced, right? Right now I'm in the process of producing educational services. Hopefully sometimes go and get a haircut. And those, of course, aren't goods, those are services. So we need to make sure those are counted too. Total production of goods and services, as I mentioned, we have to have a particular place in mind. Let's say the United States, or Russia, or Japan, over a particular period of time. So we'll talk of GDP in the United States in 2020 or in 1956. Oops, sorry about that. And then I'm going to leave another blank. All right. So what's the first blank? First blank is the following. Let's consider this bottle of tea, which unfortunately is empty, but at some point it was full. When it was full, when I bought it from the store, it was ready to be consumed. It was all done, already. When a good is already all complete, all done, ready to be consumed, and is purchased by the final user, in this case, me, we call that a final good. And those are the only ones we want to count when we're measuring GDP. Why do we only want to count these? Well, what other kinds of goods could there be? The other kinds of goods there could be, if you reverse engineer my definition, are goods that are not complete, are not ready to be consumed. Such as, I don't know, the water that became incorporated into this tea. Whoever made the tea had to buy the water and then brew tea leaves to make this, right? Those goods that become incorporated into other goods, we refer to as intermediate goods or services, and we don't count them. Why? Because if we counted them, then we'd be counting, let's say, if we added the value of the water in this tea and the value of the final tea, then we'd be counting the water twice, basically. So that's why we don't. We just count final goods and services. All right? Next problem. How do we add them up? Suppose we had an economy that made one bottle of tea and one phone. Do we say that the GDP is 2? No. We have to find some common way of measuring them, and a common way of measuring them that also makes economic sense. Now, this tea cost, let's say $3, and this phone cost, I don't know, let's say $300. So in that sense, that tells us that this thing was much more valuable, this phone was much more valuable than this tea, and so you would think that means that phones should be counted in GDP more heavily than the same unit of tea. And so that suggests that the way to add all these up is to use their prices, in particular their market prices. So there we have it. We have a measure of economic activity based on the production of final goods and services. And how do we add them up? We add them up using market prices. All right. Great. So now let's do that. Let's take the United States and add up the value of final goods and services in the United States for many different years and see what it looks like. So this is a figure that plots annual GDP in the United States measured the way I just described, year on year, since 1959. What do we see? It goes up. What does that tell us must have happened over this time? Actually, if we think carefully about the definition, it doesn't tell us very much. So if you look at the definition, there are two reasons why GDP could go up over time. One reason would be great. Maybe the United States economy has been able to produce more and more and more stuff year after year, more and more final goods and services. That would be great if there's more to go around. But if you look carefully at the definition, there's another phenomenon that could be responsible for this instead. You could have this figure, this number increasing over time without, even if the number of goods and services hasn't changed at all. And what is that? Well, if you look at the definition here, let's bring it back up. It's total production of final goods and services measured in a place or a particular period of time. We see it rises over time, year on year. That could be because the final goods and services increase, or, as Sophia just said in the chat, and Marshall just said in the chat, it could be because the prices are changing over time and going up and up and up and up and up. So that means that this definition is not really enough for us. We're going to need something better, something at least that distinguishes between prices and quantities changing. So what happens is that this thing that we wrote down, that is measured using the market prices from the dates when the things were produced, is known as nominal GDP. So nominal means it's measured using the prices from the date itself, as opposed to what? Well, we would like to have an alternative that doesn't confuse inflation for growth in production. And if we had such a thing, it would be called real GDP. So conceptually, the way we're going to do this is by measuring real GDP in the same manner that we compute nominal GDP, with one difference. That difference is that instead of using market prices from the year, let's say in 1959 we use the 1959 prices, in 1960 we use the 1960 prices, and so on. Instead, we'll be using prices from a base year. What does that mean? It means that we're going to pick one year as the year that we're going to use as a benchmark. Let's say 1959. In that case, that was the first year in which we had data in that figure. It doesn't have to be that date, it could be any date. But you need to fix it and state what it is. And then say, I am going to use 1959 as my base year. And so every year that I'm computing GDP for, I'm going to use the same prices. This is conceptually the idea here of real GDP. And that way, you can see that any change, let's say any increase in GDP over time, cannot be because of inflation, because you're not using the prices from each year. you're using the prices from the base year. The prices aren't changing. Right? So that's what we're going to be using. And just quickly, what happens if we do that? What happens if instead of measuring GDP the way I said before, which is nominal GDP, we instead use real GDP? And here again, I'm using 1959 as the base year, so of course they have to start off the same that way. We see that there is still some growth, but not nearly as much. So what is responsible for this gap? Well, any growth in nominal GDP that's not matched by real GDP indicates inflation. So there we go. We're going to measure production using real GDP, which is just adding up the total value of final goods and services in a place over a particular period of time using market prices from a base year. So all you need to do to change this definition is take this from a base year and add it there. Got it? This should be, again, a refresher for most of you. Well, for all of you. It's just a question of how long ago was the last time that you had to do this. Any questions about this definition? If not, then our next problem is to define inflation. So let's define inflation, and I want to make a note here before we do that. In the textbook, in many figures that have to do with inflation, you will find that instead of writing out the word inflation, what they often do is they represent inflation using a letter. I think I mentioned this some time ago. They use a Greek letter. They use the letter pi. So I'll try and always write inflation rate when I'm writing figures that have to do with the inflation rate. But remember, again, in the textbook, it's usually written using the Greek letter pi. Okay, just keep that in mind going forward. So at the simplest level, inflation, as I think we all know, is just the increase in prices, or an increase in prices, but we'll be interested in the inflation rate, which is not an increase in prices, but the growth rate of prices between some date t to some date t plus 1, let's say. So if t is 2000, t plus 1 is 2001. If t is 2020, t plus 1 is 2021. So we're going from year to year. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we would need some indicator of prices. Let's call it P. So PT is price in year T, so P 2020 is prices in 2020, and so on. So first, what's the change in prices from T to T plus 1? Well, it's the prices in T plus 1 minus the prices in year T. To make it a rate, what we do is we divide it by where it started. So if PT was 100, PT plus 1 is 102, and we know there was 2% inflation. Finally, usually inflation rates are expressed as a percent. How do we get a percent out of this? Multiply by 100, as usual. So if we don't have this, then we're expressing inflation as a fraction, multiply by 100, and we get it as a percentage, which is usually how inflation rates are reported, so that's fine. Any questions about this? Okay, so then the next issue to deal with is which prices are we going to use to measure P? If we want some indicator of what prices are doing on average. It turns out that there are several alternatives that depend on what you're trying to do. Remember that in that picture that I showed you earlier, there is, I said that this gap here, this increasing difference between real GDP and nominal GDP has to reflect increasing prices, right? And which prices would it be reflecting? Well, the prices of the things that go into GDP, the prices of final goods and services. So, one possibility is that we use the prices of final goods and services. But that's not the most familiar measure of prices that we use to compute inflation, right? You probably, well, when you think about prices, my guess is that you usually think about something called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. We don't need to worry about how it's measured, but it's using the prices of consumer goods, which you might do if you're trying to understand to what extent is inflation affecting people. So that's another kind of prices you could use. And there's a third commonly used index of price, measure of prices, of average prices, which instead of looking at what consumers are producing, it looks at what goods are being produced and their prices. Not at the point when they reach you and me, because of course that's the same thing as final goods and services, but when they leave the factory door. And that's useful just because it's the first time that a good gets priced, right? It's left the factory door, it goes to a distributor. So if those prices are going up, it's like an early warning signal of inflation coming towards us. So doesn't matter which, for us, it doesn't really matter which way we want to measure prices. They tend to move together. The key thing is that we need a way of measuring prices, and then once we have one, whether it's goods and services, consumer goods, or goods being produced, that sounds like something Doge would say. Goods being produced. Either way, we can use this formula just to compute the inflation rates. And that's what we care about. Okay? Great. Any questions, comments about what inflation is? All right. Then, our next job is the hardest one, which is to try and put together the theory of how things like inflation and GDP, real GDP, are determined. And to do that, we're going to borrow from our friends down the hall, the microeconomists. Now, if you ask a microeconomist a question like, well, they don't care about macro so much, but imagine you ask them about particular good. Let's say the market for mangoes. If you ask them about the market for mangoes, and you say, well, I want to know something about the amount of mangoes produced and what's happening to the prices of those mangoes, they would say, I can help you. Here, let's draw these two axes. Here we put the quantity of mangoes, or whatever it is that's in your market. And here we put the price of those things. And now I can tell you as a microeconomist that almost surely the demand for mangoes decreases in the price, and the supply of mangoes increases in the price. Now I might need a mango expert to tell me what kinds of factors, aside from the price, might affect the demand and supply for mangoes, right? There may be other factors, like maybe if papayas become expensive, people switch to buying mangoes, and that shifts the demand curve. Or maybe if it rains hard in the mango producing countries, it becomes more expensive to make mangoes, or mangoes become scarce, and then the supply curve shifts, right? But subject to that, I just put together this picture, which is the micro demand and supply approach, and asserts that economic theory tells us that the actual price and quantity of mangoes should be determined by where demand and supply cross. And then, using that, I can tell you what I expect to happen to the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity of mangoes if any of those things takes place. For example, papayas become expensive, people switch to mangoes, demand for mangoes increases. I predict quantities will rise and prices will rise. Or, what was the other one? There's bad weather where mangoes are produced, the mango crop is partly ruined, supply goes down. I predict a decrease in the supply of mangoes, in the quantity of mangoes, and increased prices. Why don't we just borrow from our microeconomics friends and do the same thing for macro? Let's posit that instead of there being a market for mangoes and tea and phones and everything else, why don't we just put all those markets together and say that there is a market for all final goods and services. Now we need some price concept. Now, there are two versions of this. In one version, you put PT here. Remember, PT is just our measure of what average prices are. But there's another version of this theory that instead of putting PT, puts the inflation rate. And there's several reasons why it makes sense to put the inflation rate here rather than some measure of the price level. For one thing, we know that your measure of prices is going to look very different depending on what your base year is. Or depending on which particular measure you decided to use, rather. Actually, both of those things. Whereas your inflation rate shouldn't matter. It doesn't matter what your base year is if prices increased 3% from one year to another, you're going to capture that. Another reason is more theoretical. We'll get to it later, that it's really the inflation rate that affects macro things. How high or how low prices are isn't a concept that really makes much sense. So our theory of how we're going to understand the determination of these things we care about, aggregate production or production of everything, and inflation, is going to be a macro version of demand and supply, which we're going to refer to as the theory of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay, so just like over here with the market for mangoes, our job is going to be the same. Let's try and figure out what is going to be the relationship between the inflation rate and how much people want to buy, which we would call aggregate demand. Is it downward sloping? And what kinds of things might move it? Then, hopefully by the end of today, we'll have established that the aggregate supply surely slows down like this. Then our next job will be to think about aggregate demand slopes down like this. Then when we're done with that, we'll have to think about aggregate supply. Things there will be a little different, but we'll get to that on Wednesday, if not the following week. Okay, so we're going to try and think about inflation and real GDP in much the same way that we think about markets at the micro level in terms of demand and supply. It won't quite be the same, but there'll be enough similarity that it'll be useful. And again, you may have seen this before, but depending on which textbook you were using, it may or may not have had the inflation rate here. You're going to see it's much more useful to have the inflation rate there. Any questions or comments about that task or that next step? No? Okay. We're moving pretty fast today. I guess we do have quite a bit to do before the end of the semester. So then let's focus on that, the aggregate demand. And what we want to do, just like with mangoes, is figure out two things. One is what are the factors that determine it, and the other is what are all the factors that determine it, and in particular, what is the relationship between aggregate demand and the inflation rate? Before doing that, and again, this should be a reminder of something that you may have done recently or not so recently. When macroeconomists think about aggregate demand, we tend to break it down into certain chunks, because there's certain kinds of goods that have different determinants. Their demand has different determinants. I'll show you what I mean in a second. First of all, macroeconomists often refer to GDP in general and as using the letter Y, and that's because you may recall GDP equals total income. So the letter Y is used to represent income. Why not I? Well, because I was already taken by something else. So aggregate demand we would call Y with a little d next to it to remind us that it's demand that we're talking about here, demand for GDP. And the biggest part of aggregate demand of GDP is spending on consumer goods, things like tea, things that we eat, use up. So that's represented by a big C, and that's consumption. So most of GDP is consumer goods that we use up. However, it's not all of GDP, just like consumers are not the only entities that buy things. There are also firms. They buy other things. They buy, let's say you wanted to build a factory to produce, I don't know, green tea. You would need to build a building, possibly. You would need to buy new machinery. And those are not consumer goods, because they may survive over many years, and their job is also not to be used up by you and me. Their job is to produce other things. And spending on these goods altogether we call investments. And that is the concept that has the letter I reserved for itself. So we've taken care of the people, we've taken care of the firms. Are they the only purchasers of goods and services? No, they're not. There's also government, the big G. So government spending is also part of aggregate demand. Spending on office equipment, who knows, missile systems, it's all government spending. Are we done? Not quite. Aside from consumers, firms, producers, and the government, who else might buy goods made here over a particular period of time? People abroad. So we'll need to account for the possibility of exports. Just as we want to account for the possibility of exports, we need to account for the possibility of imports too. This says product of Taiwan. So this should not enter, I bought it here, but it should not enter US GDP. It wasn't made here, right? So we have to subtract imports. Exports minus imports, rather than have all of those words floating around, the textbook just calls them net exports. NX. So that is aggregate demand. And why do we do this? We do this because, to some extent, the determinants of these different components of aggregate demand might be different. So to understand how aggregate demand behaves overall, it may be useful to look at each of these separately. Or at least have in mind that anything that affects any of these four things, in turn, will affect aggregate demand. So let's start with C, our friend consumption. What might affect consumption? What affects how much or how little, aside from your desires to buy stuff, what affects how much or how little you're even able to buy of consumer goods? Any ideas? One possibility is savings. Someone wrote income. Sophia wrote income. So let's start with income first, and then we'll go to savings. When we say income, we have to be careful about what we mean, because I may earn X dollars in a year, but I don't actually get to decide what happens to all those dollars. Because every year on April 15th, what happens to, I don't know, like 20% of my dollars? The IRS takes my money. Right. Well, I have to pay them, but if I don't, then yes, they come and get it. I have to pay taxes. So the income that matters here is not going to be just our income. It'll be our income minus taxes. And incidentally, just as there are funds that I earn but have to pay to the government, there may be funds that I didn't earn but that the government gives to me. Like what? I don't know. Some of you may have received $1,400 checks. Or last year there was another check. I think were they $2,000 checks last year from the government as pandemic relief. Those are, or stimulus checks, however they were called. Those are not earned income. Those are examples of what we call transfers. unemployment benefit, stamps, social payments. Yes, someone unmuted. Go on. Or was there an accident? Okay. So income minus taxes plus transfers. That's the income we're really talking about here. That's what matters for your spending, and that is called disposable income. Right? Because you don't get to spend your taxes, but you actually do get to spend any transfers that you get. Then Sophia suggested savings, and that is a good idea. Now let's think about something. Suppose you had any, if you have any savings, what does it mean? Where do they come from? I guess there are two possibilities. Is someone unmuted? I mean, please contribute. Better raise your hands though. It's easier. Could be from your income, right? It must be from my, if I have savings right now, it must be from my past disposable income, some of which I decided not to spend, and now it's still around in the form of savings. I may also refer to this as wealth because the text does as well, right? If I'm living in this house, it's because I saved up and bought it. Or did I? I guess in part, because when you buy a house, you have to make a down payment. But when you buy a house, what do you usually do? That would be number 3 on this list. Exactly. You take out a loan, you borrow. So there's a third way of spending here. Maybe the house wasn't such a good example because arguably the house is not a consumer good, it's more like an investment good, right? Because it lasts for many years. Let's say when I finished graduate school, I finished working in May as a student, as a teaching assistant, and then my job at GW as a professor started in late August, and I wasn't going to be paid until September. So I didn't have any income because I couldn't work here. I was an international student. And I certainly didn't have any savings for the simple reason I'd just been a graduate student for 5 years. It's not like that is a lucrative job. So somehow I had to survive that summer, and I did so by borrowing. How could I borrow with no savings and no income? Well, it's because I knew I had this nice job at GW coming up. So I was able to borrow because I was going to pay it with my future disposable income. So current savings on spending on consumption is coming out of my current disposable income, my past disposable income, and my future disposable income. Which is interesting because it kind of seems to suggest that as long as I'm able to access my wealth and borrow against my future income, my consumption should not be very, should not move around much. It's like my entire lifetime earnings are what should determine my consumption now. Unless something happens, erases a big chunk, or changes my wealth significantly, or something happens that makes it harder to borrow against the future. Even so, we have enough here to actually draw a lot of conclusions about aggregate demand. So to do that, let's quickly draw our little figure again here in the corner. We've actually achieved a lot here. We have achieved, I would say, 3 things. One of which goes a bit beyond what we were originally planning. First, we have enough here to figure out what is the shape of the aggregate demand curve. Suppose we increase the inflation rate. So suppose we happen to be here. There's some inflation rate and there's some amount of aggregate demand. What's going to happen if the inflation rate rises? Considering that these things are the ones how much I can afford in the first place. What's increasing inflation to my ability to buy stuff? Well, what is inflation? Inflation is this stuff getting more expensive. I can't afford as much, right? Unless all my savings are indexed, higher inflation means I can buy less stuff with it. Unless my disposable income is somehow indexed, so inflation, it goes up with inflation, higher inflation means my income doesn't go so far. So all that suggests is that when inflation rises, our spending power declines, which suggests that the aggregate demand Hello, everyone. Not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. I'm back. I was in the process of going through the list of things that we might know might shift the demand curve. So rising taxes lowers disposable income, so it might shift left. What about transfers? Taxes are a minus and transfers are a plus, so it should be the opposite, right? A decrease in transfers should shift the demand curve to the left and decrease demand. What else do we have here? We have wealth, right? What if something happens that makes the stock market decline significantly? Well, that's the wealth of quite a few people. So if something happens that decreases wealth, that would also move the demand curve to the left. What else do we have? Well, borrowing matters. So there are several things that brings up that might matter for aggregate demand. One is, this is particularly important for us, the cost of borrowing, right? If interest rates rise, then it makes borrowing more expensive, so that should reduce our spending. If interest rates drop, it would be the other way around. And the text points out one more thing, that the fact that our spending is at least partly determined by borrowing implies. That is the following. There may be times when, whatever the interest rate is, banks simply decide that they don't want to lend to you. There may be a banking crisis that means the banks would rather sell as many assets as possible, hold tons of reserves, and not lend. So the way the textbook phrases that is that it says that one of the factors behind our ability to borrow is what he calls financing frictions. And if financing frictions become severe, any factor that makes it harder for banks to lend or less willing to lend, then that cuts you off from the possibility of much borrowing. Of course, it might also lead to a decline in your wealth. Financing frictions going up makes borrowing harder, and so, or accessing your wealth harder, and so that should also decrease demand. And one more thing before we move on to the third thing we've achieved today, I think. Notice that when you borrow, you have to borrow against your future income. Of course, we don't actually know what our future income is yet. So really, this should be expected future income. So if you receive any news that suggests that the future might not be too bright, that could also shift the demand curve to the left, potentially. I just mentioned that because there's this thing called the Keynesian theory of macroeconomics, and in Keynesian theory, this particular factor is what they think is the most important one in aggregate demand moving around. Not everyone agrees, but I thought it's worth mentioning. So we have this list of factors that might shift the demand curve, and notice that, of course, we could flip all of these arrows, right? Taxes going down means demand goes to the right, transfers going up means demand goes to the right, and so on. But it's good to keep this list around so you know, so you have all the factors that could matter. What's our third achievement? Notice that interest rates are controlled by the Fed, at least to some extent. So what does this mean? It means that suppose something happens that shifts the demand curve to the left. Let's say financing frictions get worse. The Fed, since it has some control over interest rates, could push back by, oops, there's a mistake here. Obviously, interest rates going up is what would shift this to the left. So when something happens that shifts the aggregate demand to the left, which might decrease GDP, the Fed can push back by lowering interest rates and try and get it back where it was. Of course, that's one of the key things that the Fed tries to achieve with its monetary policy. So this one, since the Fed can control it, it can use it to try and offset any of the other factors that might move the demand curve. You can see taxes and transfers are there as well. They're controlled by the government, so the government can also play some role in trying to stabilize aggregate demand. But of course, they aren't controlled by the Fed. They're controlled by the Congress, so they're not something we're too worried about. A movement is a shift. So the idea is that if something, let's say again, financing frictions threaten to move the demand curve over here, the Fed can try and lower interest rates, and that would have the effect of trying to push it back. It may not work, but that's the hope. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? All right. If not, then I guess it's time for our exit quiz. 3, 2, 1. This is one where I just want to hear your opinion. What leaps to mind when you hear someone say GDP? I'm just trying out this new type of question. There are no points for this one. This is just a poll. Let's see. Outputs, gross domestic product, economic prosperity. Okay, good. I see. Excellent. So it makes you think about what it is. This one you have to order some words. GDP measures the total something of something goods and something using something prices. So pull them into the right position, and then click the K to submit your answer. The total something is something goods and something using something prices. All right. Most of you got that right. Excellent. Number 3, real GDP measures market prices using what? This is real GDP. Prices from a base year. Everyone got that right. Excellent. Good to see. Next, another word cloud. What leaps to mind when you hear someone say aggregate demand? Let's see some repeat answers here. CIG and X, total demand. Very good. Very funny. What is the aggregate demand curve? Which one of these breakdowns is correct? All right, most of you got that right. Very good. Next, why does the aggregate demand curve slope down? Is it the force of gravity? Force of liquidity? High inflation makes us wealthier, or high inflation makes us less wealthy? All right, that's right. High inflation erodes the real value of your savings. 7, what is disposable income? That's right. Everyone got that right. Good job. Next, in this image, what is the Y label? Inflation rates. That's right. What is the X label in the same image? It is real GDP. Which of the following might shift the aggregate demand curve to the right? An increase in interest rates, a decrease in the money supply, an increase in wealth, or a decrease in inflation? Can't be a decrease in inflation because that's already in the figure. It has to be one of the others, and it's an increase in wealth. Almost there. Which of the following might shift the aggregate demand curve to the left? That is the other way. That's right. It is a decrease in government spending. Suppose we're falling into recession. What might the Fed do to boost demand? Lower interest rates. They can't raise government spending because that would not be the Fed. All right. Suppose we're falling into recession. What might the Fed do to boost demand? Here it's a little harder. You have to think how they would achieve the answer from the last question. That's right. They could increase bond purchases. Suppose the federal funds rate is shooting up because of a bank panic. How could the Fed counteract this? Increase reserve requirements, increase bond purchases, raise the discount rate, or raise high GW. They could increase bond purchases. That's right. Increasing reserve requirements would make the problem worse. Last of all, who is the chair of the Fed? It is Jerome Powell. Very good. Let's see. How do we do? Ezra's third. Good job. Sophia's in second. And first of all, we have Marshall. All right, Marshall. So, what should I do with Snapchat today for our closing minutes?
How about cowboy hat?
Cowboy. Let's see what happens if I write cowboy. How's this?
It looks very nice on you.
Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. Here's another one.
Nice
This is
mustache.
even better. Yeah, I thought about that one. All right, thanks everyone.
Have a good day.
Hope
Thanks
that
very
was
much.
useful. Take care, and see you soon.